Hi, everyone, and welcome to Catalysts for Change, the show where we explore the stories, strategies, and turning points of leaders driving meaningful impact in their communities and across the country. I'm Adam Lister, and I'm so glad you're here today. Today's guest is someone that I've known for nearly 15 years. I didn't know it at the time, but a conversation we had in our office at the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce changed the course of my professional career. It was 2013, and David Mansouri, now the president and CEO of SCORE, came into a meeting with me and my boss at the time, pitching an advocacy strategy for the upcoming legislative session. Again, I didn't know it, but that conversation led to significant impacts in my work and a fundamental shift in where I thought my career would go. At that moment, in that meeting, the issue he raised struck me and the folks there on my team as a non-issue and something that was really a matter of settled policy and not worth revisiting. But here's the thing. We listened and trusted David and his team and followed his lead. Thank God we did. That strategy ended up laying the foundation for much of the work that has shaped the last decade of progress in Tennessee's education policy. That was the first time I saw firsthand what so many others would come to know. David brings an unwavering, contagious energy to everything he does. As president and CEO of SCORE, David has led one of the country's most respected education advocacy organizations with that same passion and clarity of purpose. In today's episode, we talk about the journey, the challenges, and the lessons he's learned, and the strategy behind building a movement for student success. So let's get started. David, thank you for being here today. And for the listeners who may not know who you are, can you start by sharing a little bit about what SCORE is and what you do as their CEO?
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam. It's a real treat to be here with you and to share a little bit about what we do at SCORE, and just grateful for your friendship and partnership for so long. So I serve as president and CEO of the State Collaborative on Reforming Education, and SCORE is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy and research organization focused on really improving educational outcomes for Tennesseans. The organization was founded in 2009 by Bill Frist, the former Senate Majority Leader and U.S. Senator from Tennessee, really with a goal of dramatically improving educational outcomes in K-12 public schools in the state. And that work of really being focused on improving educational outcomes for students has really been the guiding kind of principle for the organization's work over the last 16 years or so. And I've just been really fortunate to be in the seat as the president and CEO for the last 6 years, a little bit over 6 years, and really just honored to do the work that I get to do every day, and work that I think is one of the most important policy and priority areas that we can be focusing on in the state.
You're a graduate of Rice and Vanderbilt University, and I didn't travel to those institutions, but I went around on their websites, and I couldn't find anywhere in their alumni or career offices a pamphlet or a link to education policy nonprofit CEO. Did you always envision yourself working in this work at the intersection of policy and education, or did you get inspired by something along the way?
Yeah, so I had have had an interesting career trajectory and education trajectory. So I grew up in Williamson County and right here in Middle Tennessee. Was interested in lots of different things, but when I was applying to college, I knew there were two things that I was interested in studying that I wanted to focus on. One is I was really interested in and passionate about politics. I just thought politics was fascinating. I had done some internships and worked on some campaigns in high school, and was just really interested in the political world. And so one of the things I was interested in studying in college was political science. And then I'm also completely unrelated. I'm also a classically trained violinist, and had some gifts at music that put me in a position to be able to consider going to college for music as well. So I was looking for places for college that had strong music programs and strong academic programs. And because I didn't really actually know what I wanted to do professionally. I didn't know which of those two paths I wanted to go on. So that led me to Rice in Houston. I spent 4 years there studying both music and political science. And every summer I would intern on campaigns for half the summer, and then I would go to a music festival and do music work for music lessons and studies for half the summer. And then my junior year of college, I had an opportunity to work essentially full-time in the summer and then into the fall, working in the political space. And I thought it was a great opportunity to just give me a sense of whether this is something I wanted to do for my career. And I totally fell in love with it. I got bit by the bug. And so my first couple of years post college graduation, I worked in the campaign space. I say campaign, really two different kinds of campaigns. Political campaigns to help folks get elected, and also issue campaigns. So I worked on a number of different campaigns related to key policy issues that were sort of hot topics at the time, and had the really good fortune and pleasure of working on a gubernatorial race. I worked on a presidential campaign, worked on a number of different state House and state Senate races. Loved it. Just had the best time. But even through that experience, what I learned is that I was more interested in the policies that someone wanted to advance once they got elected than I was in the politics of getting them elected. And I worked for a number of candidates who were really interested in education and very focused on education as a key priority area, and particularly focused on early education. So as an example, making sure that students are able to read well by the time they get to the third grade. So I got really interested in education as a policy area, and interested in the connections between education and other policy areas. We obviously know that improved education outcomes results in improved health outcomes and lower incarceration rates and improved civic engagement and more economic mobility for young people. So I just got really interested in education and got interested in candidates who were working on education issues. And then in 2010, a good friend of mine had started SCORE with Senator Frist the year before, and the organization was sort of in a kind of an initial growth phase, beginning to hire some staff after the first 2 or 3 folks who were on the team. And they were looking for someone who had some political and advocacy and communications experience and who was interested in education. And I'd done a couple cycles of political work at the time and said, hey, this is actually perhaps a perfect fit for me to explore this policy issue that I was interested in. So I joined the organization in December of 2010. And remarkably have been at SCORE for almost 15 years. And I think if you had asked me in 2010 whether I would still be there 15 years later, I definitely would have said, no, I don't think that's possible. But what's been, I think, really cool is the organization has perfectly sort of, and the work I've been able to do has perfectly connected my interest in politics and change and impact in this sort of policy and civic world with a policy area that I think is, one of, if not the most important policy areas that we can focus on, and that's making sure that education is preparing students for a successful career. And so been at the organization for almost 15 years. I went back in 2012 and got an MBA from Owen, really with the goal of positioning me and giving me the skills I needed to be in a position of leadership at the organization. And it's just been a really fun set of work and really meaningful set of work. But again, to your question, I sort of kind of fell into doing this work, just following my passions, things I was interested in, things I was intellectually curious about, and have just the really good fortune of working with an amazing group of people today.
Yeah, I identify with a lot of what you've said. When I was a kid, I wanted to be Matlock. And one of the reasons was because I loved hot dogs. Yeah. And I thought he had really cool gray suits. And through a series of experiences, I found myself in the advocacy and nonprofit space, similar to you. And it's hard to reverse engineer that and then plan it from the beginning.
Yeah.
So Tennessee has gone from 45th to 13th in education rankings over the last several years. And a lot of the work that you have led and that I have partnered with you on has supported those outcomes. You recently described Tennessee's 20-year education story as one of, quote, steady improvement.
Yeah.
Looking back on that time, what were the early decisions or conditions that you think made that tremendous growth possible? Because we haven't seen that anywhere else in the country.
Yeah. So I think it's a couple of things. One, and I think this cannot be overstated, is the importance of strong civic and political leadership who were focused on driving change in education, believed it was a critical issue. And you know, what's unique about Tennessee's story of improvement over the last 15 years or more is that leadership has come from both within the public sector and from the private sector. It has been leadership that has crossed political parties. And, you know, if you think about sort of the early phases of Tennessee's reform journey in 2007, 2008, 2009, you know, Governor Bredesen was in his second term, and you know the state had received some very concerning news. And 2007 as an example.
Governor Bredesen, former mayor of Nashville,
right? Exactly.
Last Democrat elected to serve as governor of Tennessee.
That's right, exactly. And so in 2007, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out with its Leaders and Laggards report that gave Tennessee 3 Fs in the performance of our education system. You know, one of those Fs was for truth in advertising. So we were telling students in Tennessee that they were 90 plus proficient on the state test, but when compared to a national assessment of student progress, you know, we were in the 20s in terms of proficiency of students. So just a real discrepancy between what our expectations were for students in Tennessee and what the expectations were for students, you know, in the broader world or across the country. And so, you know, Governor Bredesen and legislative leaders at the time really took ownership over that and said, you know, we've got to do better. This is something we've got to improve. And that really began, I think, some early work to raise the expectations that we have, you know, for students in Tennessee. And then that work really was built on in a very significant way by Governor Haslam, who said, you know, setting high expectations for not only students, but also for educators is going to be a key priority. And so Governor Bredesen and legislative leaders then moved forward with this set of work around raising academic expectations, improving teacher evaluation, and making evaluation and professional development and feedback for educators a much bigger priority, raising the level of rigor on our state's assessment to better measure student progress in a way that, you know, helps us understand whether students are competitive with their peers across the country. And then, you know, adding on to that, a really focused commitment around making sure that there isn't a financial barrier to students accessing post-secondary education through Tennessee Promise and the Drive to 55. And then, you know, even up to the current day, you know, with the current administration, Governor Lee really prioritizing strong career pathways and career and technical education, and making sure that students are on pathways that lead to high wage, high demand jobs in an ever changing economy. So these like priorities have been consistent for multiple administrations and political leadership, multiple commissioners of education, multiple legislative leaders. And I think that's unique. It's a really like special part of the Tennessee story. So leadership really is a part of it. And then, you know, I mentioned a couple of these things, but I think there's some just foundational policies that have made a huge difference. And, you know, I think this is an example of the power of policy, of what policy,
let me kind of layer onto your point about the policy. But I'll make a point first. You said something about nonpartisan and bipartisan. Yeah. I think it's easy to forget that during that initial Leaders and Laggards report, we had a Democratic governor and a Republican presidential administration that then transitioned in this state to a Republican governor and a Democratic presidential administration. Yet that work sustained, didn't necessarily get easier day over day, year over year, but the work sustained. As you're thinking about the policy piece, I'm curious to know what were some of the big moments, but then also what were the decisions or the things that didn't feel flashy to you at the time, or may not have gotten the headlines that you think that they should have had, that were big moments that turned out to be critical.
Yeah. Well, let me also just say, I mean, to your point about sustaining and prioritizing things across changes, I mean, that is literally the initial impetus behind Senator Frist's creation and sort of vision of what SCORE should be as an organization. There should be an organization that sits outside of state government that is thinking about the long game, right? And that is shepherding changes in who sits in political offices, or who is in appointed offices focused on education, with a long-term perspective on the key levers that are going to improve education outcomes, with a belief that if you bring lots of different partners together and you focus them on a core set of priorities, and you sustain that focus over the long term, that you can make significant change for students. And so I think that's like connected to this question of what are the key levers, the things that really mattered. I mean, to your question, I think some of the things that have made the most difference for students are things like raising the expectations that we have for kids, and then maintaining those high expectations over time. So increasing the rigor of our academic standards, measuring whether students are meeting those expectations, using the data that we get from those assessments to adjust teaching and learning, adjust policies as we need to, and then sustaining that commitment to high expectations for students, a commitment to assessment, looking at data to measure student progress, maintaining that commitment over time. I think that's, again, like to your point, that doesn't get like tons of attention right now, but those like core things really matter. And they've mattered, I think, over the last 15 years for Tennessee. Another example is, Tennessee put in place in 2010 a multi-measure evaluation for K-12 teachers, right? And so prior to that point, teachers in Tennessee were evaluated approximately twice every 10 years, kind of on an up or down evaluation. And this new evaluation gave teachers lots of feedback every year on their performance, how they could improve. Part of the evaluation was based on how their students were actually doing. And there is clear research from our colleagues down the street at Vanderbilt who have now shown that multiple measure evaluation, this higher quality teacher evaluation system that we have in place in Tennessee, has led to improvements in student achievement. And so that sort of, again, commitment to high expectations and measuring results not only matters for students, it also matters for the people who are at the front of the classroom.
We'll link to some of those studies in the show description, but I think it's also interesting to point out that not only is there academic research that points to those facts, but there's also anecdotal political message polling that would indicate parents and teachers are both satisfied with that system.
Now, let me also say, I think it's important to note that has led to important progress. It's led to sustained progress. And it's not been enough to get to where we want to be for kids. And I think that's really clear. And, you can see that obviously as a result, if you look at the data as a result of the pandemic, where lots of states, pretty much every state across the country, took a big hit in terms of student achievement. However, Tennessee was a state that was positioned perhaps better than any other state to recover from the impacts of learning loss more quickly. And so even, over the last 4 or 5 years, political leaders in the state put students first, prioritize students and strong education policy, and put in place things like tutoring programs and extended learning into the summer, and a focus on high quality early literacy instruction, and really moved aggressively in the face of the pandemic to make sure that kids weren't falling behind. And so what we see today, to your point earlier, is that Tennessee is one of the few states that has almost completely recovered from the impacts of the pandemic. And in many grades and subjects, we're now exceeding pre-pandemic outcomes for students in Tennessee. So that focus on things like standards and assessments and data, that matters. And it's not enough. We've got to keep pushing for the next phase of reforms that we know are going to be good for kids. And look, even though we've made so much progress for students, and we're in the top 20 top half of states on all of those national assessment measures, it's not good enough, right? We still have a lot more work to do. I mean, we're 41% of students in third grade today are reading on grade level. That is not acceptable. And we've got a lot, we've got to keep pushing harder and more aggressively and more innovatively until we get to the point where every Tennessee student's prepared for the future.
I appreciate you calling out. There are a lot of measurements for these rankings, and the one that I cited earlier was specifically to fourth grade math. But I'd love to turn a little bit away from the policy and think a little bit more about the people and the person and how you as a leader orient around this work. I've not met a leader yet who has not faced at some point some sort of setback in their work, personally, professionally. I'd love for you to spend a little bit of time sharing with us about a moment or maybe moments where something didn't go as planned and how you handled that, both for your own just ability to navigate through those challenges, but then also to keep the organization focused and productive and moving forward toward its mission.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you maybe one specific example, and then a sort of a broader sort of set of considerations around how just things change in the work. I remember there was a policy issue that we worked on probably about 10 years ago that we just thought was so good for students in Tennessee. It was really around making sure that we were measuring student progress in the state and assessing student progress in a way that would give us an apples to apples comparison with how students in Tennessee were doing across the country, right? Give us the ability to really monitor how we're doing in a way that would allow us to say, here's how Tennessee kids are doing compared to kids in Kentucky. And we could see that every year and for every grade. And that issue, like a lot of issues, ended up getting sort of embroiled in a broader national conversation about how we measure student progress and about the role that states have to play in measuring student success. And so even though we thought that was the right thing to do for kids and being able to measure student progress, do it in a way that allowed us to compare progress to other states was the right thing to do, we had to recognize that politics is part of this work, right? And even the best policy solution has to take into consideration what policymakers' goals and objectives are, and sometimes that means you have to change course, right? And so, in that specific example, we had to say, hey, look, the thing that we thought was the best for students in Tennessee, we may need to take a different path, and we may need to take a different path that requires us to think in a new and different way about how we do assessment in the state. The other example, and this is a little bit broader that I would give, is just a recognition that that things are always changing in the policy and political space. We talk on our team about the fact that change is the only constant, and I think places where the work has been the hardest is where sometimes we haven't been as open to the way the work is evolving and shifting and changing. And so what we try to do at SCORE is to regularly ask ourselves, what's the next phase of work need to be? What do students need next? Where do we need to go next as a state in terms of how we improve educational outcomes for kids? And so, as an example, right now, a major focus of our work at SCORE is on making sure that education students are receiving is really connected to what employers are looking for. And this is a relatively new area of work for us, but it's because there was really a realization that just because students were getting a great K-12 education or just because they were completing post-secondary education doesn't always mean that is leading to a high wage and high demand job. So the work has to evolve. The work has to change based on what research is telling you, what student data is telling you, based on what's politically feasible, right? Based on what elected leaders are interested in doing and wanting to advance. And so, you just have to always sort of be open to change. And remember, again, we talk about this a lot on our team. Change is only constant. That's the only thing that we know will be true is that the work will be shifting and changing. And it's our job to figure out how to respond to it.
I think back to 2018, there was the largest transition of lawmakers out of the General Assembly, the Tennessee General Assembly, since Reconstruction. And on its face, that's a tremendous statistic.
Yep.
That a lot of new faces, jokes around the building at the time. And if I'm not mistaken, they may have literally moved buildings around that time as well. But there were a lot of jokes about lots of folks are not going to know where the restrooms are. Lawmakers are going to have to wear name tags, kind of this long list of things. I think the practical impact of that, though, goes back to your point about these are issues that we and others have been talking about for a long time. And when you have the largest transition since Reconstruction, there are a lot of people that come in on January of 2019 that were not present for the conversations that helped steep them in the value of the policies that SCORE and others were advocating for from 2018 going back to 2010 and into those days that we were talking about earlier. SCORE often works across political lines and change is constant, priorities change, lawmakers' faces change. When you think about the stakeholders and the different political lines that you all have to work across and their competing priorities, how do you, maybe as an organization, balance those things? But I'm also curious, you as the leader of the organization, how do you balance those things?
So for us, this starts with the DNA of the organization. So the C in SCORE stands for collaborative. Part of Senator Frist's founding vision for the organization was the power of bringing together a cross-section of stakeholders who all cared about education, even if they had different perspectives on how to improve education. And so this, the initial work of SCORE was bringing together educators, policymakers, business community, philanthropy, the teachers union, the Charter Schools Association, local community-based organizations, really to bring all those stakeholders together to say, what are the most important levers to improving educational outcomes? What does the research show us? And then can we align around the biggest levers and put aside our differences outside of those levers to really focus on improving educational outcomes? And so that initial commitment to saying, how do we actually bring as many people around the table as possible with the goal of improving educational outcomes for students in the state? That is a part of the founding vision that Senator Frist had for the organization. And it is part of our DNA to this day, where we are often asking on our team, who else can we bring around this table? Who else should we talk to? What other perspectives do we need to engage in this work? And again, that's shifted and changed over time. We don't always do the best job at that. There's always room for improvement. But bringing lots of different stakeholders together is sort of core to how we do our work. And we think about that in the way we engage with policymakers too, right? I mean, even if we don't agree with a certain policymaker on 99% of the education issues that they're working on, if we can find alignment on one issue, we want to work with them on that issue to advance outcomes for students. And so I think this orientation of being pragmatic, always looking for partnerships that are going to be good for students, sort of in some ways putting aside kind of ideological differences and really just having an orientation of what do we know is good for students and being open to working with anybody to advance those priorities. That's kind of how we think about our work. That in an increasingly politically polarized world is sometimes hard to do, right? But again, we talk a lot on our team about being focused on the issue right in front of us. What does the data tell us? What does the research tell us? And being open to working with anybody to advance that issue on behalf of students. And so that orientation is I think a unique part of how we think about our work. Again, it's part of our name. It's also part of our core values as an organization. We talk a lot about this core value of collaboration and bringing stakeholders together to align around, around a common set of priorities for educational outcomes. And as a leader, that can be sometimes hard even within an organization, right? Everybody's got their own perspectives on what issues we should be focused on. Everybody has their own things that they feel personally passionate about and that they care about as individuals, right? And so, I think sometimes that means you have to be willing to put aside your own priorities personally to advance the mission and the priorities of the organization. And I think you've got to be willing to talk about that. What does that mean? Why are we doing that? Why are we focusing on these set of priorities? But I think your mission has to come first, right? Especially as the leader of the organization. You have to always think about, is this advancing our mission, or is this not connected to our mission, or is this hindering our mission? And just always being focused on, is this advancing the mission that we have as an organization? And then, being really communicative and engaging with your own team about how to make sure that you're communicating those decisions well.
Yeah, I think your point about talking about it often with your team and the challenges that you face there really resonates with me, both on a professional and a personal level. Yeah. I have a sign in my garage of an old man with a fisherman's hat sitting next to his boy on a dock. And the sign reads, it's a kind of a generic prayer, "Dear Lord, help me to be the father my son thinks I am." And I think the challenge for an organization like yours, or for a lot of organizations, is collaboration is in your name.
Yeah.
And you bring in a lot of stakeholders. Yep. And sometimes it's stakeholders that are in a different place than you are for a variety of different reasons. Figuring out how to also show up and have those same values exhibited and lived in the people that are closest and know you best can be hard, because it can be tempting to let our guards down, or to kind of ease up on that value with the people that we feel most comfortable
Sure. Well,
with.
I think that's why it's critical as a leader that you have people around you who are going to give you feedback on what you're doing and the decisions that you're making. And I think that's true within your organization. I feel so grateful at SCORE. We just have an incredible leadership team of individuals who are leading huge portfolios of work, and we try to make decisions as a group, right? We're wrestling with things as a team together. And it's my hope, I don't know if I always get this exactly right, but it's my hope that those leaders also are willing to say to me, hey, that decision we're making doesn't feel right? Or is not aligned with our mission, or we should rethink that decision. So I think it's important to have that in your professional. I think it's work. I think it's also important to have partners and friends, who are also able to say to you, hey, I think you need to think about this as a leader. This may be may want to think about this a different way. So I think having those kinds of people, whether they're in your organization, outside your organization, mentors that you can go to ask questions, test ideas. For me, that's been really important. If there are times where I'm having to make a really tough decision, acknowledging that there are other people that I could get feedback on to help me make sure I'm making
the trust that you have to develop both ways in order to be able to have those conversations, because it's going to hit your ego and your pride the first time you hear it, no matter who you are. But to be able to then take a step back and recognize, okay, this is because they're invested in me personally and they're invested in the work that we're doing, that they're bringing this thing to me that may feel uncomfortable and not so great. I can remember a couple of occasions where you and I have had some of those moments on, and I think both of us have been on the receiving end.
Well, and I also think, there's a book that we ask any new member of our leadership team to read at SCORE, called Leadership as an Art, which is one of my favorite leadership books. And I think a big theme of that book is a sort of a reminder that the role of a leader is to be a steward of the organization's mission and strategy and priorities, right? And so it's not about you as a leader; it's about the organization's mission. It's about and that is true whether you're in a nonprofit organization or a for-profit organization, right? It's about what the organization's mission is trying to accomplish. So I think that can give you a little bit of humility too, just remembering, right, that you are there as a steward of a mission that is bigger and larger than
it'll exist beyond
than
your
yourself.
time.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So, David, I am struck by something that you've said a few times. I've seen it at convenings where you have spoken. I've seen it in op-eds that you've written. But this notion that just one more third grader in every classroom reaching proficiency each year could change the game.
Yeah.
Why is that kind of clarity and incremental progress so important in driving systems change?
Yeah. So this effort is an effort that we've launched over the last 6 months called Tennessee 2030, and really the thinking behind this effort is really twofold. One is, what are the next set of goals that we should have as Tennesseans for where we want the state to be in education? What should be what should our goals be for critical metrics like third grade literacy or seventh grade math or post-secondary enrollment or post-secondary completion or careers degrees that lead to economic independence. And it's again, it's this belief that having clear goals gives you something to work towards. And so we felt like it was important, particularly at a moment where Tennessee has made a lot of progress, to also be willing to say, well, that progress has been important. We have a lot more work to do. And then to say what we think those goals should be, right? Over a time period that is, not over the next 50 years, but over the next 5 years. So setting goals over the next 5 years. And then the second is to figure out how to explain those goals in a way that is tangible to policymakers, to state leaders, but even to parents and educators. And so, we have an incredible team of folks at SCORE who are looking at the data and doing data analysis. And so the concept that they essentially came up with was, what would happen over the next 5 years if each year one additional student in each, as an example, third grade classroom.
So this just started with a curiosity.
Yeah. It's like, let's look what the data would tell us. What would happen if every year one additional student in each classroom in third grade in a public school in Tennessee was proficient in third grade reading? Where would that get us by 2030? And that mattered to us because that feels very doable, right? I mean, that feels ambitious, but it feels doable. We're talking about one
teachers and principals
additional
can go
student.
put their hands on the shoulders of that one kid.
Exactly. And the numbers are pretty remarkable, right? You go from 41% proficiency in third grade ELA to, I think, 71% proficiency in third grade ELA in that time period, 2025 to 2030. So we mapped the same thing for seventh grade math. We mapped the same thing for post-secondary completion rate. And so what we have now is a set of goals for 2030 that we think should be sort of a guiding set of priorities for the state and something that we want to challenge policymakers, philanthropy, folks who want to run for offices to say, okay, how do the priorities that you want to advance, how would they meet these 2030 goals? And importantly, we also think those goals are aligned to measures that matter for students in obtaining high wage, high demand jobs that are allowing for economic mobility and economic independence. So that's really where this concept came from. And sort of a lens that we're going to wear as an organization to look at the next set of policies and priorities for the state.
So we've talked a little bit about policy, elected officials, transitions, all of these sorts of things, and the challenges in keeping people aligned around these issues over the course of that constant change. We are on the cusp of pretty major transitions in political leadership in Tennessee. How do you keep these education goals and the ones that existed prior to that, which are, I would argue, still relevant, front and center in those conversations? And how do you get lawmakers and candidates and other stakeholders aligned around the implementation of that agenda as other things begin to shift?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, it's important to note, I mean, and we know this from polling that we do, that voters in Tennessee think education is one of the most important areas that the governor, that the legislature, that political leaders in the state can be focused on, right? Like, voters understand. They know why that matters. They know why it matters for economic mobility, for economic independence, for Tennesseans. So, I think this education as an issue is something that voters understand matter and also understand matters to preparing students for the future. So we sort of see the moment we're in two different ways. One is we've made a lot of progress that we've talked about, and we need to continue the things that have helped us make this progress as a state, and a recognition of the fact that we are not even close to where we need to be in terms of making sure that every student is prepared for a successful career. And so the area that we're spending a lot of time on right now, that we're really obsessed with organizationally, is one of the areas that we think is sort of a next frontier issue that we are hearing a lot of policymakers talking about. We hear that we hear voters talk about, and this is really work around making sure that education and employment are better connected, and that there is not a gap between the educational experiences that students are getting and the jobs that we want young people to be obtaining. So, we are hearing policymakers talk about this issue a lot, about pathways, about making sure that the degrees and credentials that students are getting are high quality, right? That they're leading to good jobs. We hear a lot about things like reskilling and upskilling and making sure that Tennesseans have the skills they need to get the jobs of the future. I think things in that space are the next set of work that we have to do as a state, and really owning having the best prepared workforce in the country, and an education system that is preparing students for that success. So that's one issue that we think is really a sort of a big play for the state in the future. The other, I would say, is thinking about innovative school models and approaches in new and different ways. So I'll give an example. One school that we're really excited about that's opening in Nashville this fall is Nurses Middle College. So this is a high school model that is really totally focused on healthcare pathways for students. Students starting in the 9th grade, they're wearing scrubs. They're getting an accelerated pathway into a nursing program. They have formal partnerships with healthcare systems in the community. It's a really special school. It'll be a school that's opening this fall. And more of those kinds of innovative models we think are like really exciting and critical to providing options and choices for families and for students in ways that lead to post-secondary success and career success. So those are two examples, like this focus on education to employment and this focus on innovative new models, including high-quality public charter school models, that we think are sort of in many ways, the next phase of the work that is building on the success and these key priorities of expectations and accountability and feedback, but that help us to go even farther, that we think resonate with folks who are considering running. We know these issues also resonate with voters too.
This work and the change that you're advocating for doesn't happen organically. I'm curious to know, what are the unique levers that you and your organization have pulled that have allowed for the work that you do to be successful?
Yeah. So there are two that come to mind specifically for me. One is, so an important part of our work at SCORE is a little bit of sort of being an R&D lab, right? So it's trying new things that we think will lead to improvements in student success, right? So, one effort that we launched really more than 10 years now was an effort in partnership with multiple school districts across the state to really rethink the way those school districts were delivering early literacy instruction. So really focusing on a higher quality curriculum, training teachers around the sort of research-backed methods of improving early grades literacy, and then really doing that in a collaborative way, giving teachers strong professional development. So we launched a network to really focus on that work with a handful of school districts across the state. And what we saw is like really tremendous gains for student achievement in early grades literacy. And then part of our job as an organization is then to think about, okay, well, we find something that's really leading to improvements for students. How do we scale that across the state? And so we were really proud to work with state leaders over the last 5 years to take many of the lessons learned from that network and put it in practice across the state. And so now in Tennessee, every student is learning in the early grades from a really high quality curriculum in reading. Teachers are getting strong professional development, and what we know research is telling us leads to students learning how to read. Even our teacher preparation programs, right, are doing work now to make sure that future teachers are learning how to teach reading in research-backed ways. And I think all of that work is leading to we know that work is leading to significant improvements in student achievement and more students reading on grade level than we had before. So that's one example. And then the other is really proud of the work that we've been able to do in collaboration with lots of other partners and with state leaders to rethink the way we fund education in Tennessee. And a couple of years ago, the state completely reimagined the K-12 funding formula, the way we fund education, and moving from a very complex funding formula that was really based on a whole range of different sort of outputs to actually saying, what are the things that students actually need, and building what's called a student-weighted funding formula for the state, so funding based on student need. And then the governor and the legislature put in $1 billion of recurring extra resource into that funding formula. So we're at a point as a state now where we've significantly increased the investment in our highest needs schools and districts in Tennessee. And, money matters when you focus it on the right things. And we're really excited that Tennessee has reimagined the way we fund education to really focus on the highest and most important levers in improving student achievement.
That's awesome. I know you've heard me say this before, but the year that the student funding formula that was recently replaced was passed, I was in third grade. And the year that TISA was passed, my son was in third grade. And when that hit me, it was a really interesting and personal realization of how impactful and long-lasting these policies are, but also a challenge to get it right. And when you don't get it perfectly right, to go back and fix it. Because there are a lot of kids that are going to go through the public school system over the next 30 years when our children are advocating for something and theirs are in third grade. So I'm going to make an observation that there have been a few times where I've asked questions that you could take one of two roads. I'm going to talk about how I think about the work, or I'm going to talk about how the work gets done. And almost every time, but for a few moments when I've deliberately said, talk about how you think about the work, you've defaulted to the work and its impact. And I think it underscores both the importance and the continuity that an organization like SCORE is building around these issues. And it also, I think, underscores the power behind the work that you all do, because you're able to put front and center the things that you do and the impact that it has on people. And when you can approach serious problems that have really serious implications if not addressed, and you can anchor that in the vision and the mission and the impact that you want to have for folks versus the ways that it advances members of our team individually, I think it brings a level of credibility and honesty and authenticity to the work that you do that helps the impact. And I think it becomes a circle of just continuously growing power and good. But that said, I'd love for you to reflect in the last couple of moments that we have together on you specifically. And I'd love to know if you could just share with me what's some of the best advice you've ever received and how's it guided your leadership? And I'll give you a part B question if you want to take this one instead. If you could go back to a younger version of yourself and give yourself some advice, what would it be? So I'm curious. It's a little bit of a potpourri question. I'm curious which way you're going to go, but help me understand a little bit more about what you specifically are thinking about, or what you would do and how you would tell yourself to think about in the future.
So maybe I'll answer both. I mean, I think a couple of like frameworks that I often think about just for myself, for my own leadership, that matter to me. One is, and we've talked about this a little bit already, but that change is only constant. And I think it's exciting when things are evolving and shifting and changing, and when we're like embracing a new strategy or a new set of priorities or new things that are coming. I think that's exciting, but that's not the case for everybody. But I think change is only constant is a sort of a framework that I always try to keep front and center. Something else. This is like a framework that I've read about somewhere, but it's these these sort of two bounds that leaders need to have. They need to have deliberate calm in the way they work, and they need to have bounded optimism in what the future looks like. And those two bounds of deliberate calm and bounded optimism, I try to think about a lot because sometimes my optimism cannot be bounded, and I might be deliberate, but I'm not that calm, right? And so thinking about those in my own leadership and sort of how I try to approach the work with our team, that's sort of a framework that's mattered to me. And then maybe the third, and this is just top of mind right now, thinking about just the amazing leadership team that we have at SCORE is just constantly thinking about what my role actually is, right? And asking myself, what does the organization need from me today, right? What does the work need from me today? And a lot of times, particularly because we have such an amazing team, my role is actually to be a coach, right? It's to be a coach and kind of an advisor to folks on our team. And it's not always to be the person who's out front on every issue. It's to help other people be the ones who are out front on certain issues. And so that just again, that orientation of asking yourself, what does the organization need me to do, and B, what does the work need me to be today? I think is one that's, always that I try to keep sort of front and center. What advice would I give to myself? I mean, honestly, probably something around it's going to be okay. You just need to chill out a little bit. I think I can get probably overly worked up or concerned about the future. And, I think there's some healthy part of that, right? Because it forces you to scenario plan and think about what if and prepare for different scenarios. But I think in the end, it turns out okay. And so I could probably have saved myself a significant amount of anxiety by having my current self go back to my younger self and just tell him it's going to be okay.
Yeah. I think of an old Three Stooges line of, I resemble that remark.
Yeah.
A version of your calm and optimism. I try to think of challenges or opportunity or good news in the same way that I look at a double yellow line on a highway. It's just constant and consistent and be steady. Yeah. But similar to the optimism, I'm always trying to think about what are the opportunities double and triple and quadruply clicked down that we might be able to take advantage of, realizing you're probably not going to pursue those things, but they might spark an idea somewhere else. But I also think to your point about advice about it's going to be okay, the downside of that is when a challenge comes, the first instinct I have is to then scenario plan by walking through all of the worst elements of that battle.
Yeah.
The good that comes out of that though is you're better prepared if something then does happen. But you have to live in that self-inflicted pain for
at 2 a.m. in the morning.
At 2 a.m. in the morning.
Yeah.
So we're wrapping up here. I appreciate your time today and you being so generous with us. I'd love to ask two final questions, and these are for the folks that are listening. What is one lesson you hope listeners take away from your story specifically? And then how can people support or engage with SCORE's mission?
Yeah. So I think one lesson that I feel like have learned from our work at SCORE, and again, this just goes back to Centerfist's vision for the organization, is that change happens over time, and being focused on a core set of things and committing to those things over time, that's what leads to sustainable change. You can make change quickly, may not be sustainable, right? And sort of that just value of bringing people together, aligning around some priorities, and then really committing to those priorities over the long term. I think that matters. That matters in any sector, in any area of work, and it certainly has mattered to our work at SCORE. To learn more about SCORE, our website's tnscore.org. We've got all of our reports. We do lots of different events across the state on key education issues. The Tennessee 2030 data and work that we've put together is also there as well. So I would encourage folks to check out our website, engage with us on social media. We're always looking for feedback from folks in the work, and also want to learn too. So we would look forward to thoughts and feedback that folks have as they look through our work.
Well, thank you, David. Huge thank you to you for joining me today and sharing some really honest and vulnerable feedback and reflections on leadership and impact and the work it takes to create and drive real change specific to public education. Your journey reminds us that strategy and heart aren't at opposites with each other, that they're essential to lasting progress in this work. If you have enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating or review and share it with someone you think would find it valuable. We have more incredible guests coming up, so be sure to subscribe to Catalysts for Change wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks again for listening. Until next time, I am Adam Lister. I'll see you soon.